Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're going to be analysing Ode to the West Wind by Percy, Bysshe, Shelley, and before I go any further I'd love for you to hit subscribe to join my tribe for all things English, literary and grammatical. I'd also love for you to look down below to see the other poems I've analysed in the Romanticism collection, but also other poems by Shelley. So Ode to the West Wind. To many it's an extended metaphor. To others it's actually all about regeneration. Now, whether it's about the power of the west wind to destroy the old leaves and preserve the new seeds, there is an undeniable sense that this poem is about changing the order of things. It's about reflecting on the glories and power and dominance of nature. And this extended metaphor, in many ways, could represent the frustration that Shelley felt at the tyranny, the politicised tyranny of Christianity on the Western world that he'd encountered. But he writes this poem in 1820, not long after his son William has died, and he's also writing not long after the Peterloo massacre, which happens where we have 80,000 civilians that are killed at the hands of soldiers. So the title Ode to the West Wind might seem a bit foreign and odd to us. An ode is a praise poem, if you didn't already know, glorifying an event, a person or a moment. But the specific mechanics of the structure of this poem are crucial for us to get our heads around. I'm going to race through this quickly, and I also just want to caveat, I don't read it all at once. I read it and analyse as I go through, so we're not doubling up on imagery. It's split into 5 cantos, and each of those has 5 stanzas within it. So there are 4 out of the 5 stanzas that are made up of 3 lines. It's called the tercer rima. It's a rhyme scheme that's used by Dante in Divine Comedy, and that's where the first and the third lines rhyme together, but the middle line does not. So the middle line is used to fuel what happens in this next stanza along. Let me demonstrate. I'll demonstrate in a quick second, but I also think I should just share with you now that the final couplet rhymes with the last middle line. Let me just explain that. So that would be something like this. As you can see, A and the other A are in lines 1 and 3 of this poem. But as you can see, the middle line B becomes the fuel for the next stanza along and such. Now, you might think this rhyme scheme has very little to do with a poem about the west wind. To me, the structure of this poem mirrors the flow and enjambment and the giddying sense in which the wind is disorientating the poetic voice. There's definitely a sense in which this poem is fueling the frustrations of a very deeply politicised poet. But he also clings to some Christian analogies that to me suggest someone who might be grappling with their own sense of spirituality, even if it isn't of the Christian faith. Now, however you see this poem, I would love for you to comment down below on what you think is going on and whether this poem is about regeneration or purely frustration. Let's get into it. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, the winged seas where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odours plain and hill, wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear. We're instantly struck in this first canto by the power of personification that's shown through the capitalisation of the west wind, but then accentuated further by the use of the word breath. As if the wind is breathing through the autumn. The wind sounds both victorious and impulsive when the adjective wild is used to describe it in the opening line. We learn of its unseen presence, which seems, well, almost spiritual, as if, like the Holy Spirit, is running through. And it has an unseen presence that shifts along the leaves that are dead. It moves the dead leaves, as I say, but in a way this sounds so poetical as a kind of life being given to these leaves as they're driven. The simile like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Echoes how the wind pushes away what's dead, but also pushes away, fleeing, both ghosts and death as an idea. There's so much force and power in the wind. Now, as we move on to learn more about the leaves, in line 4 we're struck by the colours that are used to depict the leaves. They're not put forward as beautiful. They're yellow, black, pale, hectic red. They're depicted really as quite death-like and disease-stricken. Even the phrase pestilence-stricken suggests that these multitudes of leaves are not being comforted where they are heaped. Instead, there's no peace. They're struck by disease. The reference continually to thou is significant. It suggests that the poetic voice has a closeness, hence the praising narrative of the ode, which is obviously giving thanks. But we're shown that the leaves are chariotised to their dark wintry bed. So their symbol of death and decay, well, they're escorted by the wind. That point is laboured by Shelley. But then we flip that slightly by thinking about seeds that are obviously about to sprout, you'd hope. Well, that's not what Shelley's drawing our attention to. Instead, we're told that these winged seeds, they're lying cold and low because it's winter. But they're described in the simile each like a corpse within its grave, as if they're ready to die, as if they're already buried. But then we get the connective until winter. When it's over, of course, what follows is spring, and that shift with the connective until then gives us the image of the azure sister, the personification of the next season, spring. And the power of that shift from the deadly depths of what the wind does with death in winter, and then how it can use its power to breed and push on hope and new life as it shall blow, as we're shown. I love the image of her clarion over the dreaming earth. It's as if the wind is heralding new life here, and it's described as having living hues. So we're given again a simile of driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air. This is talking about the process of pollination, but we get to juggle here both the mighty power and the mighty calamity that falls on the wind. As we move into the final 2 lines of the first canto, we're struck by again the description of the west wind as wild. This time it's a spirit. It has so much spiritual overtones, this particular poem, and I think that's receding back to this notion that there is so much power in nature. But does the wind act as a wild spirit to destroy things maliciously? Or is it to preserve things instead? That juxtaposition of both destroyer and preserver that we meet in the final line of the first canto is a juxtaposition that amplifies the tension that's at play with the wind. And then we've got this generalised pleading from the poetic voice that we'll see again and again in cantos 2 and 3 rather. And, hear, oh hear. And I wonder if that's the poetic voice referencing hear my cry out, or is this hear the power of the wind doing what it's doing around me right now? Thou on whose stream mid the steep sky's commotion loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled bows of heaven and ocean. Angels of rain and lightning there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm. Thou dirge of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the doom of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapours, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. Oh, hear! There's so much psalm-like paralleling going on across this canto, with the wind that's loose on the clouds and that's shaking these decaying leaves as they're shed from the earth. More than anything, we're shown in the first 3 lines of the second canto so many spiritual parallels between the ways in which the wind is tangling the bows of both heaven and the ocean. It's as if we're being bombarded with so many natural images in order to acknowledge the power, again, the magnificence of the wind. As we move into the second stanza of the second canto, the declaration and association of the wind as the angel or an angel of rain and lightning is ambiguous in the sense that, well, both rain and lightning have connotations of something that seems negative in pathetic fallacy terms, but it's ominous in some sense to be the angel of rain and lightning. But once again, we're shown the power of the wind. I think we're also drawn to the simile in the second stanza of the second canto, which talks about how there's bright hair that's uplifted from the head. And I think there's a sense here that the bright hair is the power of the wind shaking the earth. But is the head of God? Or what being is the head? There's some sort of spiritual parallel that's being forced through, and if that wasn't clear from a biblical precedent of referencing what seems implicitly Psalms, we then get in the third stanza of the second canto the reference to Dionysus's following, if you like, the fangirls of Dionysus, Maenad. They're fierce, beautiful and fierce. It's important to reference that Dionysus is the god of wine, fertility, religious ecstasy, and the idea that the hair of these Maenad would have been bright, looking like angels in a sense. But it's as if the locks are getting closer to the approaching storm. So the extended metaphor that we then get, based on the simile in the previous stanza, is drawing on the sense that whether we want biblical allusion or mythological allusion, the storm is incredibly powerful and it's fueled by the wind. Once again, whether we're talking about the zenith's height, the horizon, or the ferocity, or the fact that the Maenad are fierce in the allusion that's given, we can't help but see that the wind has power. So this is both a praise poem, but I can't stress enough, this also feels incredibly intense. This particular moment towards the end of the third stanza, as we roll on with enjambment again to the fourth stanza of the second canto, thou dirge. Wow, a dirge is a lament song that's played at a funeral. So we know death is coming, as if that wasn't clear enough already. Death is to come. And as we roll on to the fourth stanza of the second canto, we're told once again that the year is dying. The storm is approaching. We know that. And now we're in the heart of it, in stanza 4, knowing that the year is dying. The impending doom of it all. The wind is fueling it with congregated might. So in a way, the wind seems partially responsible to what seems inevitable. But that description that's so toxic in the final line of the couplet at the end, black rain and fire and hail will burst, oh hear. That's both a culmination of what seems morbid, black rain, fire, hail, these are destructive natural elements. There's so much intensity behind it. Nature has a dark side, but more potently, there's something so emotive about that reference to the darker elements of nature that do so much damage. And then, oh, here, much like someone pleading in prayer would say, oh, hear my prayer, there's a desperation that's amplified even further than what we saw at the end of the first canto. The fact that we're once again shown both the beauty and the ominous side of the West Wind is in part the power of an ode. And as we move into looking at the third canto, we see that culminate even further. Thou didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams, beside a pumice isle, in bay as bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers, quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure, moss, and flowers, so sweet the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods, which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean, know thy voice, and suddenly grow grey with fear, and tremble, and despoil themselves. Oh, here. So here we've got the wind shaking up the Mediterranean at the start of the third canto. It's waking up the Mediterranean from its summer dreams. And we know that the storm is messing in a way with the peace and tranquility that we associate. We've got the stereotypical kind of glistening associations of blue and crystalline streams. We've also got, other parallels with other works by Shelley, like stanzas written in dejection near Naples, where we also have this beautiful image of the Mediterranean Sea. I think this might be in part a reference to the fact that he writes this in Italy itself. The verb lulled alludes to the notion of hidden powers in being awakened and awoke here. And we've got some incredibly romanticised images in stanza 2 of old palaces and towers, alongside the restlessness of the wind, which is awaking again the sleepy old palaces and towers, quivering within the waves' intenser day. So it's quivering and it's fueling this intensity in the waves. That comparative intenser day suggests the storm is coming. Each of these episodes is fueling another dimension to the power of the wind. Here we see the way it ferociously moves with the sea. Yet the sea, it would seem, is dreaming for slower days. The sense faints picturing them. It's a beautiful image because this is overgrown and it's being attacked, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers. So sweet, the sense faints picturing them. We're really playing with the sense that the wind is going to do damage. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms. That enjambment between the end of stanza 3 moving into stanza 4 does the same thing as we saw in the previous canto, of building more tension. The Atlantic level powers, we're thinking what's about to change. I suspect at this point in the poem we recognise damage is about to happen. But that verb, cleave themselves into chasms, it really acknowledges how damaging and how vulnerable what's on the land is. While far below the sea blooms and oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage, again, we've got these onomatopoeic sounds that show and fuel the fragility of each creature, which is at the mercy of the impact of the wind, in this case, on the sea. We've got the personification of nature again, a pivotal feature of this ode. We've got the way in which the nature can wear and know the voice of the wind. When we go to the last 2 lines of the third canto, we can't help but recognise the image of suddenly growing grey with fear. the trembling and despoiling elements of nature. This scene seems so devastating in a sense. The inevitability of the destruction of what the wind will do forces nature to grow grey. Where is the hope in fear, we have to ask ourselves? Where's the joy in something that's grey? Especially in contrast to the beautiful blue and the kind of colour chart that we've been given of azure, moss and flowers earlier in this whole canto. That juxtaposition is there for reason. But once more, oh here, with the exclamation mark at the end of this canto. And that repetition, once more giving praise and power back to God, or to the wind rather, is so mighty. But it emphasises that nature itself, trembling at the sight, ruining itself on the spot as a consequence of the wind, is something to be both fearful of and aware of. I'm not so much sure that this is joyful in its tone by this point. The tipping point is changing now. As we read on to Canto IV, we'll see a shift in what the priority is for the poetic voice. If I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed scarce seemed a vision, I would never have striven, as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. As you can hear, this canto draws attention to the vulnerability of our poetic voice, and we get that immediately from the use of the first person. The poetic voice is imagining as if they were a dead leaf, a cloud or a wave that's at the mercy of the wind carrying them. The use of these hypothetical if-I scenarios offer an intensive reflection that forces the poetic voice to grapple with their own suffering. Yet again we encounter the powerlessness, but this time of the individual, at the mercy of the wind again. As we rove on to stanza 2 within the fourth canto, we recognise again the strength that's so intense of the wind. This time so much so that we encounter a caesura after the phrase, "Oh, uncontrollable." I acknowledge that exclamation mark probably is a caesura also, because it affirms the intensity of that statement, something that cannot be controlled. And as we see towards the end of that stanza, there's a hypothetical situation that compares the poetic voice to their immature self in their boyhood. And that comparison signals this sense of frustration and the sense that now this personal encounter with the wind is forcing the poetic voice to recognise that they are now frail, not free like they were as a boy. We see this through an implied kind of question that we encounter in stanza 3. It's never stated as a question, but that seems to be at the heart of what's going on. In stanza 3, when we're forced to question, did the wind get stronger or did the poetic voice get weaker? The comrade of thy wanderings over heaven. And then we're given the image of the wind outstripping the sky speed. So the image of a boat that's moving so fast, it moves at the speed of the wind that's moving so incredibly fast. So once again, scarce seemed a vision, like we can't believe that. The juxtaposition of the wind's power against our poetic voice's sense of weakness is unmissable. And we see that particularly in this poem at this point as we move into stanza 4 of the fourth canto, because we recognise that Shelley is sent down from Oxford University for his atheism, and yet here there's an acknowledgement and an awareness of prayer. The comparison is made to a person who's praying because they're desperate. Does this mean something of a poetic voice that is truly desperate or truly clinging to anything like even faith? But in this fourth stanza, there's an imperative mood. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. So we're pleading now that there is freedom to be found in nature. And the imperative mood of lift me is quite ironic. Is it an imperative mood, or is it an acknowledgement that the wind is powerful, the wind will control you, and it will lift you whether you choose or not, so you might as well frame it in a way that makes you feel better. The other reference in stanza 4 to biblical imagery, to me, is the notion of the thorns of life. Jesus is crucified and wears a crown of thorns. You know, the imagery of bleeding and thorns is often reconciled with the idea of suffering and pain. And you get a sense that our poetic voice is deeply feeling sorry for themselves. In the final two lines of this canto, the reference to imagery of burden, the heavy weight, the idea of being chained and bowed. If nothing else, life has been cumbersome, demanding and difficult. And that is in huge contrast to the final line we get of that canto. The comparison that implies that in youth, the poetic voice was in fact as free as the wind, wild, tameless, swift, fast, and proud, able to be carefree and proud. And so we encounter by the end of the fourth stanza this ferocious struggle, an unease in our poetic voice that's laid bare and acknowledged, and something that's dwelt on further as we move into the fifth canto. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an extinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? The incessant pleading at the mercy of the wind is made ever more clear as we begin Canto V. The offering of make me thy lyre is a declaration of just let me be an instrument for what you want. And we get this giddying sense that time is running out for our poetic voice. My leaves are falling like its own, as if to say that I beat at your drum. But also we're forced into the wind's plans. The poetic voice talks of the tumult of thy mighty harmonies, as if the only use of a lyre could be to be used by the musician that is the wind, you know. And so that extended metaphor of the power of the instrument, the poetic voice, at the hands and the mercy of the wind is made ever clearer. And as if that wasn't clear with the words used, the structure, the enjambment we've seen woven throughout this poem is made ever clearer, that it echoes the control, that the poetic voice is in the hands of the wind, as you say, and the run-on lines mirror the giddying power of the wind as it moves through. As we move into stanza 2, we learn more of the omnipotence of the wind, and it very much echoes the power that Christians would say of the Holy Spirit, because the poetic voice demands, much like Christians would say, if they want to repent of their sins and be filled with the Holy Spirit, that they would move into this space of having to let go of their old self, if you like, shake off the sins that they had. And so it's sweet, though in sadness, that this autumnal tone, this maturity needs to happen, as does the sort of determination and the description used of the power and spiritual associations that the wind takes on. The determination offered when it's talking about spirit that's fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one, as if there's so much unity that the wind and the poetic voice are one. Yet, it sounds like the poetic voice is in control here, but who is really commanding whom? It's very clear, I suspect, to you, but it is certainly to me, that this is a poetic voice who's grappling with nature, but actually it would seem to me that nature has more power. We get so many exclamation marks that run through this canto, and I think the urgency for change is made clearer. And the exclamation marks offer desperation, but let's just move forward and make strides to stanza 3. This is a very direct request of the wind, that the poet's work, the poetic voice's ideas would spread with the power of the wind, drive my dead thoughts over the universe. And we get the urgency of a legacy that needs to happen, like withered leaves as if dying, that they would quicken to a new birth. The new birth being that his works live on, even though he's dead. The incantation of this verse will outlive him. And this fixation with the idea of a legacy does not go. It stays on to stanza 4, where we talk about the unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks. And when we're thinking of that, we've got to understand that this is a poetic work that demands and offers this idea that his works could be rekindling the fire in humanity, my words among humanity, to wake up the earth. So my question to us as critics of this poem is this: Shelley, his poetic voice at least, speaking humbly, or actually showing pure and vain ambition that has not shifted in his short but very powerful life? The notion of "be through my lips to unawakened earth" doesn't help but smack of the idea that my works need to be heard, they need to live on. And these last 2 lines, they offer us so much of the desperation meeting with the ambition or awkward humility of the poetic voice. The offering of the trumpet of a prophecy. And just to clarify, this is clearly quite a biblical allusion. Specifically, the trumpet of prophecy. For Christians, this is almost personifying the wind as God, much like the trumpet of prophecy is said to be heard when Christ returns. So it's believed that, amongst Christians anyway, that Christ is said to return to earth to judge its inhabitants. And the idea of blowing the trumpet is often heralded as an idea that is akin to making life end, judging life in heaven. So here is this our poetic voice decreeing and demanding that the blowing of a trumpet is marking the end of their life. Is that the speaker's own trumpet that they hope to be blown, in a sense, so they can die? But if that wasn't enough, we get a sense that there's hope at the end of this incredibly intense poem, with the final line: "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" The capitalisation of winter and spring offers this sense of the renewal that comes in our cycle of seasons. And the hope was signalled in the idea that we might leave in death in the depths of winter, but the dead is used to rebuild and grow and renew in the season that we know as spring. So we're left with some unanswered questions, actually. Across this analysis, we've grappled with the language and at points the structure, but Shelley is ageing. He's young to die when he does, but is Shelley ageing and embracing nature as God's creation? Are we meant to see very clearly the echoes between Canto V and Canto I? Because that cyclical shift in tone that mirrors the first canto does very much tally up with the final line. The echo of the cycle of life and refreshment and renewal. In the comments down below, I'd love for you to offer up what you think's going on in this poem, and whether you think it is a masterpiece or a master pursuit in vanity.